So today's video is going to serve as an introduction to a short but recurring series on Pythagorean philosophical concepts. And today's is going to be on the table of opposites. Now, the table of opposites is between two principles, the limit, paras, and the unlimited, apeiron, or the monad, and the dyad, or the indefinite dyad, or aoristos dyad. Now, the reason I'm making this video is because I wanted to make another video that's kind of relevant to this. So this might actually help, but that other video on being and non-being is going to require more research because it's a pretty complicated problem. If you follow me on Twitter, you might have been annoyed at me bringing up the problem quite frequently. But anyways, I happened to go to a bookstore on just totally different intentions. But I found in their very, very small philosophy section, by the way, don't go to their metaphysics section, okay? You have to go to their philosophy section. But anyways, Plato and Parmenides, I happened to find this book, very relevant for that, but also relevant to this video, because the whole first chapter basically details a lot of Pythagorean concepts, in a way, in more detail than even the Pythagorean Sourcebook, which we all know and love. And if you haven't bought it, you definitely should. It's very useful, and researching a little bit of Pythagorean stuff with your Platonic studies is probably going to be a benefit. Because of course, the Pythagorean philosophy is kind of in the same tradition as Platonism, kind of. I also, at the same bookstore, happened upon The Theoretic Arithmetic of the Pythagoreans by Thomas Taylor. Of course, we know Thomas Taylor. You hear his name all the time because he's a pretty prolific translator. So the source book is Guthrie and Fideler, I should say. But anyways, it goes over the table of opposites quite a bit, and the table of opposites will be useful for the being, non-being thing. But in any case, that's what inspired this video. So let's get right into a little bit of a prelude. So the reason the table of opposites is between the monad and the dyad, as opposed to the monad and the triad or the decad or whatever number, and by the way, I might as well say this as a part of this prelude, they basically hold that there's 10 numbers and then it repeats itself, right? So it goes 1 through 10, and then everything after that is repetition, enumeration of the same thing, just like each number is an enumeration of 1. And in fact, 1 wasn't even seen to be a number by the Pythagoreans. 1 is the unit of number. 1 is the kind of object of number, of which number is an enumeration. And the monad, the 1, not the Neoplatonic 1, but 1, the monad, is the primary reality principle of the Pythagoreans, which is a little bit contrary to Platonism, or at least Neoplatonism, but also Platonism. But anyways, you have Tohen, the 1 of Neoplatonism, which is kind of, it's antecedent to both the limit and the unlimited in such a way that it prepossesses both of them in a pre-divided manner. But it can't be limited. Actually, if I get into this problem too much, I might as well just make the other video, but we'll get into that at another time. But it's between the limit and the unlimited. The dyad is the contrary to the monad because it's the instance of plurality in Pythagoreanism. It invites the possibility of logos, and everything after 2 is basically just continuing that enumeration, that plurality. So it's between limit and the unlimited. Therefore, yeah, monad and dyad. And I should say, however, which we'll get into with the table of opposites, that some of the numbers, the odd numbers, do participate more of the limit, and some of the numbers, the even numbers, and we'll see why. That might sound a little bit weird if you're not familiar with this, participate more of the unlimited. With that prelude in mind, let's get into the table of opposites. Now, the table of opposites is composed of 10 opposites, the first of which is just the limit and the unlimited themselves, or the monad and the dyad. Now, the monad is considered limited in a positive sense, as though it has definite reality, rather than a negative sense like you might think of being limited today as some kind of restriction or constriction. It's unitary, it's whole, it's indivisible, it's full of itself, right? It's self-sufficient in a way. And the dyad is unlimited because it is inherently dual. It has this inherent opposition within itself because it's two-ness, right? It has plurality, it lacks principal unity, and it is, of course, divisible. Now, the second pair is the odd and the even. The monad, or the limit, is associated with the odd, not because one is an odd number. In fact, like we said, they don't consider one a number at all, more on what they conceived it to be later. Um, but because odd numbers cannot be evenly divided. So in a way, they're participating of the limit as opposed to the unlimited because they aren't divisible evenly, right? And the dyad is associated with odd numbers precisely because it can be divided right down the middle. And we'll see more on this kind of idea with another pair, square and oblong, later on. The next pair of opposites is unity and plurality. Pretty straightforward. The monad is a unity. It is the principle of unity. Basically, monad means unit or unity. And the dyad is the initial advent of plurality in the enumeration of the monad. A bit tangential, but I can't help think of Leibniz's monadology, wherein plural monads are kind of like instantiations of the monad or of God. I don't think Leibniz actually refers to God as a monad per se. That kind of leads to people misconceiving of his system as metaphysical pluralism, but in any case, that's that pair. The next pair is right and left, and this probably alludes to left and right hand paths, which I would describe as relevant due to the right hand path being preponderantly reversive in nature. And reversion is aimed at attaining greater degrees of simplicity and unity, as opposed to the processiveness of the left hand path, which is generally associated with complexity, totality, bearing in mind that a total is a composite, and plurality. Now, the next pair is male and female. Gender is always interesting to see in metaphysics. It certainly has a place therein. Everything that exists in nature does. So the masculine principle is regarded as the definite, concrete, and primary principle, whereas the feminine is considered indefinite and posterior. Remember that the dyad is the first instantiation of plurality, and that the indefinite is taken as necessary for the continued succession of enumeration because it's basically an increase of plurality. This is to say that it is essentially the principle of gender and is responsible for birthing the continued succession with the input of units, bearing in mind again that each successive enumeration is indeed an enumeration of the unit itself. Maybe it would be more accurate to say that the dynamic between the two is the principle of gender, but in each succession, the monad is considered primary in that number, right? So in the two, it is first one before it's two. So the dyad itself kind of encompasses both the one and the two. Anyways, this does perhaps make more sense if you have a principle prior to the monad, a little bit tangential, but because then they would both exist in a pre-divided manner, but there is actually a Pythagorean explanation for this as well. Now, the next pair is rest and motion. Rest is associated with the monad, again, because it is complete in itself. Taken in itself, there is no exteriority to which it can move on account of its absoluteness. The dyad is taken to be motion as it invites dynamism between the two, whereas without it, there is only oneness, which is rest. To my mind, this would have to be situated carefully in metaphysics, as on the surface, it would seem to contradict what we have just predicated of the monad, which is there's no exteriority. In that it would seem to preclude the existence of the dyad. But I would go so far as to argue that the enumeration of the unit occurs in a way virtually within itself, meaning the capacity for such virtualization or imagination would have to be prepossessed by the primary reality principle. But I imagine I'll make another work on that topic entirely because it is tangential to this. Now the next pair is straight and crooked, and this one's a little bit abstract and symbolic, as you should avoid thinking of a straight line in the literal, infinitely divisible sense, but rather understand it as getting to straightness in itself, representing uniformity in distribution. Whereas the crooked line invites deviation and the succession of lines into planes, then solid figures, then sensible bodies, which is another Pythagorean concept. Now, the next pair is light and darkness. The monad is light because light is substantial in itself, whereas darkness is a privation of light. Such a privation being necessary for distinction from pure light as the succession of numbers continues. And it would be applied to definition, particularity, plurality of the manifested, engendered world. Right, so you kind of, in order for things to be defined, you need the indefinite, and in order for things to be defined too, you need privation of what that thing is not. So anyways, that kind of brings us right to the next one, because it's pretty similar, the good and the bad. Similar to the previous pair, goodness is conceived chiefly as that which is primarily, or maybe that should be said with a little bit different enunciation, that which is primarily. Badness or evil as privatory in nature, lacking any substantial existence in itself, rather existing purely in the context of what is. That one could probably take its own video because it gets into theodicy, but we'll leave it at that. Now the last pair is square and oblong. Now this one's interesting. The picture diagram will help, but the idea is that if you start with the unit, right? You draw a right angle around it, then you add 3 units around those lines. So this harkens back to the odd and the even. And you continue to do this with odd numbers, so 1, then 3, then 5. The shape you will get indefinitely is a square that is even on both sides. So it's uniform in both sides. Whereas when you start with 2 units, then commit to the same process with each even number, the sides are always of unequal length. The dyad is therefore demonstrated to be associated with oblongness, difference, and an equal distribution, whereas the monad is demonstrated to be associated with squareness, sameness, and equal distribution. Now, I said I would apologize for the Pythagorean primacy of the monad, just a little bit, and I will. Now, let's remember that the monad wasn't conceived of to be a number in the same way that the rest of the numbers were, because it is the object of enumeration. It's just the unit. It's the unit of number, but it's not a number in itself. Therefore, it wasn't conceived of as odd or even, but it was conceived as kind of being both, even odd. Therefore, odd numbers were more so seen to participate more directly of the limit of the monad, whereas even numbers were conceived of to participate more of the unlimited. But anyways, this understanding kind of lends itself more appropriately to what would be demanded of a first principle, because the monad would, in a way, prepossess then the unlimited. And here's a quote, a relevant quote from Theon of Smyrna's Arithmetic, fragment 199b. It reads as follows, quote, "The unit partakes of the nature of both, since when added to an even number, it makes it odd, and when added to an odd number, it makes it even. Hence the unit is called even-odd." Aristotle had also commented on one to the same effect. I can't actually find the direct quote, but so claims Cornford of the Plato and Parmenides text. I'll take his word for it. Now, I feel compelled to speak more to the numerology itself because it's pretty interesting, like what each number actually associates with or is associated with. But to get a little bit of a preview for that, let's open up our Pythagorean Sourcebook, which of course you have, to page 322 if you have the same copy as me. Well, it starts on 321 with the monad, but let's go to page 322 where you can see all of these nice little diagrams are... Wait, hold on. Let me see if I can make this work with the light. Can you see that? Yes, there you go. I'll give another example. The hexad, actually let's do the heptad, is associated with Athena, the forager, an epithet of Athena, citadel, hard to subdue, defense, virgin, revered seven, things like that. It's interesting. I think the most interesting is the first three, the monad, dyad, and the triad. Now, I don't want to get too deep into that because I could just make a pretty short video about it. And then the decad itself, because again, 10 is seen as the perfect, complete number, after which you just have repetition of the same 10 numbers. That'll be it for today's video. Hopefully you found something useful. Apply it to the Platonic limit and unlimited, or at least use it to enhance your context while you go through those things. I know that if you just apply the modern conceptualization of limitedness and being limited and unlimitedness, you might want to cast unlimitedness back to a first principle without qualification, and I mean that's kind of the intuitive thing. But anyways, hopefully you found that useful. Thank you for watching. This has been Ars Philosophica. um Reach out if you want to join a reading group or join a server where we talk about metaphysics and philosophy. And until then, take care. Bonus footage. This is the real Philosophica.